I am a male and now 30 years old. My family moved to the States when I was around 14 years old, but I grew up in Russia in a town called Kirov. Kirov was big enough to house a full spread of criminal activity, from organized crime to cannibalistic hobos. These few stories are not tied together with anything else other than a cultural connection. Brief, absolutely true, and hopefully will give you a small glimpse of the state the country was in the 90s, right after the collapse. When I was very little, we lived in a typical Russian 5-story apartment building in a what would be considered middle-class neighborhood. It was fairly quiet, with nothing much happening, so us kids could play outside for as long as we wanted without adult supervision. I remember a man living on the first floor of our building, his kitchen window overlooking the staircase which ran out onto the sidewalk. He was probably in his mid to late 30s, always wearing a dirty wife beater, never a clean shave. Every time, it seemed, as I would walk or ride my bike by his window, he would be sitting there, sometimes a glass of milk in hand. He then would jump up from his chair and begin to yell and shout as loud as he could at me, swearing, calling me names, threatening, in fact. All of this he would do with excessive violent movements and facial expressions. As a 4-year-old, I would just stand there in horror watching him do his crazy murderous acting. He would fall on his elbows on the windowsill and shake his head, feverishly spitting out curses and deathly threats at me, his eyes bulging. He would punch his chest with all his strength, and almost in tears of some deep rage would announce of his hatred toward me, and how much he wished me dead. And if that wasn't enough, he would then pretend to be going for the door as if finally having found the resolution to go through with it, then coming back to the window and more shouting, more threats. I just remember never being able to stay there for the horror that overtook me, and I would always run in the end, leaving the crazy man just staring at me out of his window. One day, he was just gone, disappeared. No more insane man in the window. Being a kid, I just moved on with my life and didn't think about the matter for years. Until much later, I told my parents about him and what he did for the first time. The story they told me confirmed my suspicions of his true nature. Around the same time as one of the last that I've seen him, a strange occurrence happened in our city. Body parts were found scattered throughout the city, all far from each other, and all belonging to one unfortunate man whose wife plotted to kill him for the sake of acquiring his apartment and belongings. Her brother happened to be the freak living downstairs, who both violently killed the husband, dismembering his body in a tub, and distributed the pieces, including the head, all throughout town. Everything led to the wife, and it didn't take long for her to blame the entire adventure on her dear brother, who to this day is sleeping in some dark cell far away in the cold. Another story is that when I was in 8th grade, my school started to have roof problems. It was an old building which used to belong to some merchant who lived back in the days of the Tsars, and every year it seemed to give more and more until one day it finally gave, when there was a class full of students and the ceiling fell on their heads. For the time it would take to restore the building, the student body would attend classes in public school. Let's call this school 22. I still remember it clearly, a fortress of bad behavior bordering homicide. The students of 22 mostly came from awful circumstances and enjoyed humiliation, severe beatings, just any kind of abuse. At that time, street fighting was also very common in the country, and the fights rarely ended up with just a black eye or a busted lip. Broken bones, skull fractures, coma and death were routine. One day, as my friend and I were talking in the hallway between classes, a big, bold kid came up to us with his entourage of hopeless degenerates. He told us how they had enough of us and were planning to beat the life out of anybody from our school once classes were over. They didn't like us from the start because our school was considered preppy, and they acted as if we were intruding in their territory. He told us they were all going to be there, and it was gearing up to be a great show. We knew immediately he meant what he said, as this guy held a certain authority in that dark place, and most kids were afraid of him. He was one of those people who learned to swing at anyone who did anything as much as annoy him. And he wasn't alone. They were many. We told our teachers what he said, and they let us go secretly 20 minutes before the last class was over. My friends and I banded together as we got dressed for the winter day outside and left the school 20 minutes early. The plan was to stick together and walk to the bus stop. I got on my bus and stood by the window. The route led right by the school, and I would be able to see the courtyard in front of the main entrance and what would be happening there. As we were driving by, what I saw became etched in my mind for the rest of my life. On the white snow, in the clearing before the large doors of 22, was an assembly of 200 to maybe 250, mostly male figures, dressed in black colours and forming a giant circle. In the middle of the circle, I could see a fight underway. Just two of them. One with his arms thrown open as if taunting his opponents, and the other, someone who did not look like they wanted to be there. This turned out to be a big operation on their part, as it looks like more were invited to what was being planned. I later learned that once they found out we left early, as the final bell rang, all of my classmates and I were already gone, they decided to beat on their own, and some poor kid was picked and beat so hard he ended up in an ICU. Since my school was very small in numbers and some parents altogether decided to homeschool their kids for the time of the repairs, we would have easily been outnumbered 10 to 1. I hate to think what would have happened if our teachers did not let us go early that day. On the next day, armed security was on the school premises, and they stayed there until we were able to attend our old, but now clearly loved home of a dead merchant. Going back to a time when I was a kid, this last story is my personal claim to victory in the game of life or death, which happens to fall in our hands from time to time, for no apparent reason at all. I was maybe 9 at the time. We moved to a better area, more space, better location. Our apartment was on the last, 6th floor, and the last one on the landing. It was the furthest you could go from the entrance of the building, and fairly secluded. The staircase was also completely indoors, essentially housing anyone who entered in a climb, floor after floor, with 4 apartments to a landing. This day, I came home from school around 2 p.m. My parents weren't due to be back home for at least 3 hours, and I set about doing my casual homework, watching TV and emptying the fridge. It was around the time I settled in for an episode of Babylon 5, a plate with a bit of everything on my lap, that I heard the front door bell ring. That was very odd, as my parents both had their key, and no one else usually visited around this time of day. I went over to the front door and asked, "Who is it?" I heard a man answer back, "Hi there. I'm from the electrical company. We are going to do a routine check for the electrical meters. May I come in and inspect yours? It will only take a minute." I looked through the peephole and saw a young man, probably nearing 30, very clean, neatly dressed, with his hair combed to the side. He even held a clipboard in his hand with some papers attached. I was about to twist open the lock when I saw something. Because of the fisheye view I had on the landing, I also could see a little extra to the sides. On my left, the man's right, I saw light bouncing from what looked like a sharp metal object. Then, for a second, I clearly saw what it was: the cutting edge of an axe. Someone was standing to the right of the door, attempting to hide from view, holding an axe. At this point, my memory gets blurry. I remember getting away from the door and creeping into my room, which was the furthest in the hallway, closing the door and not coming out until my parents got back. The bell kept ringing for a few minutes, and then it finally fell silent. I never told anyone about it, until now, I guess. My parents split up when I was 4 years old. My dad had a history of substance abuse, thievery and cheating, and in this small town of Western Tunisia, he had no chance of keeping it a secret for long. My dad ended up with a lady named Ellen, who had a degenerative disease that eventually took her mobility. Ellen's mother was in one of the 2 nursing homes in town, and being as I spent every weekend with my dad, I spent a lot of time there. I had been around sick or elderly people for my entire life at that point, so I'd grown accustomed to helping out anyone that was less fortunate than myself. I would help out there with anything I could, feeding residents who couldn't grip silverware, wheeling them back to their rooms, etc. I really enjoyed it there for a while, and I think that was partly due to my siblings being 9 and 10 years my elders. By the time my parents had me, their marriage was in shambles. My dad was out partying all the time, and my mum was just tired. She did the best she could, but she ended up a single mother working a full-time psychology job, and just didn't have enough time to do everything she needed to do. So, needless to say, I enjoyed the attention and praise of the residents at this nursing home. Well, most of them at least. The first time I felt uneasy there was when I had been going there for maybe a few months. On this particular day, my dad and I were huddled around a dining table with Ellen and her mother. They frequently discussed things that were boring or beyond my 5-year-old's comprehension, such as mother's will and estate, so I was blankly watching the rain pepper one of the floor-to-ceiling windows. When Ellen's mother had her fill of dinner, I quickly jumped up to take her tray to the dish area. She thanked me with a grin and said, "We need more youngsters like you," as she did frequently. As I was about halfway through the cafeteria, I was startled by a very raspy voice. "I'm done too." I jumped up and dropped a fork off the dinner tray. I turned on the spot to find the source of the voice, and that was the first time I'd ever seen Chester. Chester was an elderly Caucasian man. His hair was short, grey, and usually unkempt. I remember thinking about how small he seemed. Very short and unhealthily skinny. His pale skin just seemed to barely stretch over his skull, and I just remember being generally unsettled by this man. I wasn't sure what to do, so I picked up the dropped fork, gave the dinner tray to the cafeteria worker, and sped back to my dad. I refused to look at Chester again as I walked past, but I heard a deep chuckle and his eyes followed me as far as they could. I stayed glued to my dad for the rest of that visit. I was thoroughly creeped out, but as I was there at least once a week, I continued to help out other residents whenever possible. I quickly became a big favourite with staff and residents alike. Nurses would ask me to do small things for them, and I would always happily oblige. I actively avoided Chester during my visits. He hadn't tried to speak to me since the first day I'd seen him, but he'd always watch me if I was in a common area. His eyes burned with hunger that I didn't understand at that age. Now that I'm an adult female though, I think I could make an educated guess at what he was thinking. One night, the nursing home had a dance for the residents. They played old music that some people danced to with their children or grandchildren that attended the event. I particularly remember a lively elderly man named John having a wonderful time dancing in his wheelchair. I was enjoying watching the residents in such high spirits and even got to dance with my dad for a while. When he got tired of me standing on his feet, he placed me back on the ground and spun me around a few times before calling it quits. When he began to spin me is when I noticed Chester's eyes glued to me, just a few feet away. I hadn't noticed him before that moment, but he had a menacing look on his face. It was as if the anger in his eyes was burning holes through my skin. I tried to get my dad's attention, but he only mumbled something about stepping out for a smoke and walked away. I should have just run after my dad, but I didn't. I was so afraid of Chester that I was rooted to the spot. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at him. I don't think I even blinked until he finally said, laughing,
"What's the matter with you, girl? You look like you've seen a ghost."
I gulped. My 5-year-old brain had no idea what to say or do. I kept telling myself to run outside to my dad, but I was terrified of the dark and didn't know where exactly he was at that point.
"Well, aren't you going to help an old man back to his room?"
Chester growled. Everything in me screamed that that was the last thing I needed to do. As I stood there deliberating, a nurse had told Chester that his medicine was on his bedside table and that he could go back to his room whenever he was ready. She then hurried off to the opposite side of the room to wheel another resident back to their bed. Chester looked at me as though his prayers had been answered.
"I see you helping out with a lot of patients here, kid. All I'm asking is to be wheeled back to my bed."
At this point, my 5-year-old brain had determined that quickly taking Chester back to his room was the lesser of two evils compared to venturing out into the darkness for my dad. I wanted to get over it with, so I walked quickly over to Chester's wheelchair. I heard him moan softly as I leaned down to unlock his wheel brakes. The walk to his room was short. When we arrived, I barely pushed him inside of his room and turned to walk towards the window to my dad. Chester quickly stopped me.
"I need to be closer to my bed, girl. My medicine and water are over there and I have to take it now."
I was terrified to actually go into his room with him, but I had also seen him walking around from time to time and was afraid that he would just stand up and grab me. I pushed him a bit further towards his bed and nightstand.
"Closer!"
he barked repeatedly, until I was so nervous that I almost pushed him right into the nightstand. He growled, almost inaudibly, and then sprang up from his wheelchair quickly. When he stood up, he turned around to face me. My horrified eyes looked down to see he had an erection, although I wasn't sure what it was at that age. He began walking towards me with an unbelievably creepy smile on his face.
"How about a little kiss as a thank you? Or would you like to tuck me into bed?"
At that point, I bolted. I ran outside and right into my dad, who had been smoking marijuana in his car. I jumped into his arms, crying, and told him that I wanted to leave right away. I had told him about being creeped out by Chester before, but he repeatedly dismissed it and said my imagination was running wild. This time though, he calmed me down enough for me to tell him what happened. He had a very sheepish expression at the end of it, and sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. My own dad then began to yell at me and said that I should have known better than to enter a male resident's room alone, even though he'd let me do it loads of times before this happened. I honestly think he was just afraid of my mum finding out what had happened while I was outside. I honestly think he was just afraid of my mum finding out what had happened while he was outside, getting high. I also found out later that my father was sexually abused as a child and could never talk about it, which also helps explain his shameful reaction. I did tell my mum about the situation, who was upset on many different levels. She kept telling me that she took care of it afterwards, but I still don't know what exactly happened to Chester. My mum also severely limited my father's alone time with me, which eventually changed to visits that were personally supervised by her after a few other ordeals that occurred involving him.